Anselm of Canterbury, How Scholasticism Changed the West. Through the eyes of the later Renaissance, the medieval school of philosophy known as scholasticism seemed nothing more than overly complicated theological mumbo-jumbo. In fact, this is also how many scholars see it today, and as a result, they fail to understand its importance. Covering this very topic is bound to award me with close to zero views, but I want to tell this story anyway, just because it is important. And it will be worth your time, because the story is fascinating when told right. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Scholasticism was a movement in the brand new universities of medieval Europe. It sought to bring the culture of debate and logical argumentation, which had been so popular in Greece and Rome, back into Christendom. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC, had written various influential works on debate, including his work Rhetoric, the first systematic work on the art of persuasion, his work Topics, which contains techniques for constructing valid arguments, and Sophistical Refutations, which deals with various logical fallacies. According to the Roman philosopher Cicero, Aristotle was also the first to practice disputatio in utramque partem, or debate on both sides of the issue. With this method, a topic was looked at from all sides, with the purpose not of winning the argument, but to establish truth. Early Christians also picked up on the culture of debate. For instance, the church father Augustine, who in fact was a professor of rhetoric before his conversion to Christianity, had engaged in public disputations to refute the Manichaean faith. And here we see an image from a 12th century manuscript depicting that debate between Augustine and a man named Faustus from the Manichaean faith. And behind it we see each of their students. But debate eventually disappeared when the church gained absolute control over religious affairs in the 5th century AD. As the church wished to establish itself as the only arbiter of truth, it no longer welcomed debate. In monasteries, the monks, who were often the greatest intellects of society in those days, were taught not to question the text that they studied. For why question the word of the Lord, they were told. On top of this, much of the Greek and Roman philosophical texts were lost in Europe during the early Middle Ages, although many luckily survived in the Arabic world. Medieval scholars did have access to the works of Boethius, a Christian scholar who translated various ancient Greek texts into Latin, including texts by Aristotle on rhetoric and dialectic, on the art of debate. Boethius also translated Categories by Aristotle. The transmission of this text has a messy but interesting history. From 780, only a commentary on the text was known, which was in fact attributed to Augustine, and it was also far removed from the original text. This changed in the 10th century when an anonymous translation attributed to Boethius appeared. And then in the early 11th century, the actual translation of Boethius came to light. Scholars quickly realized the superiority of this text and were mesmerized especially by its account of the physical universe, the rational universe of Aristotle, which was in great contrast to the mythological universe depicted in the Bible. It was around this time, also in the 11th century, that public disputation or debate returned to the West. In my estimation, this occurred because of a renewed interest in Aristotle, combined with just more leisure time to ponder on these matters caused by a quickly growing economy. An early proponent of debate was the Italian scholar Lanfranc, who became master of rhetoric and dialectic at the monastery of Bec in Normandy, France. The chronicler Odoric Vitalis praised Lanfranc for his ability, stating that, quote, "By intellect and learning, Lanfranc would have won the applause of Herodian in grammar, Aristotle in dialectic, Cicero in rhetoric, Augustine, Jerome, and the other commentators on the Old and New Testaments in scriptural studies. Quite a compliment indeed." Ahead of his time, Lanfranc used debate in search to harmonize reason and faith. We also know he won a disputation against a man named Berengar, and he also wrote a polemic on the matter in a form of a dialogue between the two. And finally, he also reconstructed the debate described in the Bible between St. Paul and his opponents. We also know that Lanfranc was influenced by Aristotle, and not just by his works on rhetoric and dialectic. For he also referred to Aristotle's account of the physical universe in that freshly dug up document, Categories. Lanfranc's student, Anselm of Canterbury, also from Italy, became an even more crucial figure in reintroducing debate and reason in the study of theology. He also became the first in a long time to dare mention Aristotle in a theological work, as opposed to in a secular setting, which was generally allowed. Crucially, in his text Monologion, Anselm made the attempt to demonstrate Christian truth by, quote, "reason alone," or sola ratione in Latin. To me, this sounds quite a bit more enlightened than the Lutheran scripture alone, or sola scriptura, that would become one of the slogans of the Reformation. Anselm wrote, "There may be someone who, as a result of not hearing or of not believing, is ignorant about God and his creatures. If so, then I think that in great part he can persuade himself of these matters merely by reason alone, if he is of even average intelligence." What a daring attempt in the otherwise somewhat backward Middle Ages. The work starts with the following lines. Anselm wrote, "Some of my brothers have persisted in asking me to write down some thoughts on the divine essence and other related matters, which I have communicated to them in my regular discussions. They asked that nothing should be put forward on the authority of the Scripture, and in this I have consulted their wishes. They also asked that whatever conclusion was reached in the course of each investigation should be expressed in plain language, with intelligible or reasonable arguments and simple disputation, so that the necessary conclusions and clear truth on the matter would be clearly expressed." In his classes, Anselm employed a method of instruction which he consistently called disputatio, in which he encouraged his students to debate theological issues for a deeper understanding of the material. This method is exemplified in his Cur Deus Homo, which describes his dispute with his student Boso, who came to him with perplexing questions. The active atmosphere in his classroom was also described by this historian Odoric Vitalis. He wrote, "The monks of Bec are so devoted to the study of letters, so eager to solve theological problems and compose edifying treatises, that almost all of them seem to be philosophers." Finally, you might wonder why we haven't actually discussed Anselm's ideas. This is because it is more his method than his ideas that were influential in the long run. Although his most memorable idea, his proof of the existence of God in his Proslogion, is definitely worth mentioning. Let's go to this rather clever argument. He said, "God is by definition a being none greater can be conceived." I hope we can all agree on that. He then continued that we can conceive of this concept of God in our mind. But if it only exists in our mind, then we can think of a greater being than God, namely one who exists in the mind and also in reality. But this leads to a contradiction because earlier we accepted that God was a being none greater can be conceived, As a result, Anselm claimed, God must exist in reality. Quite clever indeed. But interestingly, the idea was already attacked even during his lifetime by a man named Gaunilo, who wrote a rebuttal to his work. Hilariously, he named his text On Behalf of the Fool, since Anselm had written that only a fool would not be able to understand his reasoning. Gaunilo's criticism was that the same argument can be used to prove the existence of many things that definitely do not exist. For instance, we can also conceive of a magical lost island, he said, which is the greatest and most perfect island. And if we can conceive of this in our mind, then according to Anselm's reasoning, it should also exist in reality. Well, this is clear nonsense, of course, which in fact invalidates the whole argument. Anselm then replied that this argument could only be applied to the single greatest being of all beings, namely God. For while we can try to conceive of a perfect island, that island would be greater yet if it could also create beings and in fact the entire universe, whereupon it would no longer be an island at all. So Anselm claimed this argument only applies to God. Of course, today we recognize this as some logical word games, but it is interesting nonetheless. Now let's wrap up. While Lanfranc and Anselm had been naively investigating the fusion of reason and faith, the philosopher Pierre Abélard was willing to let these two often contradicting concepts create some fireworks. But that will be the topic of the next lecture. For now, I hope you were inspired by this lecture. If you want to know more, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com. See you next time.